Princes and Priests. Chapter 7, An All-Day Hike.
Do you think we're still being followed?
Kelly asked, as she washed Raven's scalp where it had peeled away from his skull during the fall.
Not by the ghouls,
Raven said.
They're gone.
I meant by the Baron.
She said.
Yes.
Shannon stood with his arms folded over his chest, as far from the blood as he could get, but still close enough to protect them. He knew they were far from safe, and his presence was part of the reason the local creatures were not coming any closer.
Can we outrun him?
Tavia asked.
We cut southwest,
Shannon said.
There is dark power over there.
Dave said.
The land has been warped.
He winced in sympathy for Raven.
There is no other way. We cannot outrun them, and we cannot hide from them. Our only chance is to get them killed,
Shannon explained, his head buzzing with the pain and the blood of the men in camp.
Keep in mind that the whole continent is warped, and we cannot escape that either.
Like it or not, Raven understood the thinking behind Shannon's choice.
If we're dead, then it won't matter,
Oirion said in a disgusted tone, rubbing his black and green ankle with the tiny bit of healing salve that the Baron had given them. He doubted he would heal as fast as Raven had, but maybe the salve was better than he thought it to be.
There are worse fates,
Shannon said, his tone getting short.
If we're dead. If is a big word,
Raven said.
I have been in warped lands. It's what clerics do.
Do you usually take civilians in with you?
Oirion asked pointedly.
I didn't say it would be easy, but we do have a chance.
He knew they had to try, even if it meant the deaths of some of them. There was no hope for any of them if no risks were taken.
Is there a chance?
Dave asked Shannon.
Can all of us get through the warped lands?
If there was not, I would not suggest it.
Why are we being hunted?
Theo asked suddenly, as he watched Raven sit through the cleaning that had to be very painful. Raven looked to Shannon.
Obsession,
Shannon answered simply.
I don't understand,
Theo said with a weary sigh.
It's a game,
Raven said.
If we can escape long enough, then they have to wait until next year to try again.
Like a fox hunt?
Cindy asked, excited.
Exactly,
Raven said.
Then we need to outsmart them.
She giggled.
My father says that only the smartest foxes live, because they are smart enough to outwit the hunters. He says they are the cleverest animal in the countryside.
So we go into the forest?
Dave asked with a measure of trepidation.
I guess so,
Raven said, no one else speaking up.
Shannon, did you happen to check ahead? Do you know what's up there?
An all-day hike.
Imagine that,
Oirion muttered. The hike that they were on was not that difficult compared to what Raven and Oirion were used to, but with the injuries they were suffering, it wasn't easy. Shannon was constantly trying to find a balance between hidden escape and easy enough trails, so that they could keep moving and still maintain a measure of safety. Shannon watched Raven work his magic to hide their trail while trying to find their pursuer. It was almost at times as if the dwarf was holding back, afraid to see, to know who was chasing them. The dwarf was a strong cleric, but he was playing on a level that he was untrained for. Shannon was, more than once, tempted to tell him how to alter what he was doing, just a little, to achieve better results, but he couldn't. The teacher in him twisted with frustration, and the priest in him yearned for the friendship and fellowship of a brother, but that was not going to happen, and he knew it. He looked away, feeling his heart tear in hurt and betrayal. Jerome had promised to destroy everything that Shannon loved, if Shannon didn't swear and surrender to Jerome's demands. That one vow, at least, Jerome had fulfilled.
Shannon.
Tavia was at his elbow. That woman was almost as quiet and skilled in the woods as the priests were. He wondered how she had gotten that way. It was more than just instinct, and while the other men saw only her pretty lines, Shannon noted the more telling features of the woman. She offered a little cup of the soup that she had made with the herbs and roots that she had been collecting as they traveled. It was thin, but it was a drink that would give them far more nutrition than anything in their packs. He took the battered little cup.
Join us at the fire,
she said softly, inviting him to where the others sat around, enduring more of Ivan's stories, the latest about a hugely fat woman patron who had thought to seduce him. It was a crude and rather distasteful story, in Shannon's mind.
I will stay here,
he said, looking from Ivan to her.
Perhaps with you at the fire, there might be more to talk of than Ivan's greatness.
He could just send her away and return to his dark thoughts, or he could tell her the truth so she would not ask again. She was not one who took lies or who accepted excuses that were nothing more. The little truths that he had told her had gone much farther than anything else.
At my age, my eyes are very sensitive and slow to react to light changes. It is better I stay in the dark.
She considered that and nodded a little.
Then I won't ask again, but you would be welcome to sit with us and be a part of the conversation. It would be a relief to us all if Ivan had less opportunity to brag.
I imagine all that would happen is that Oirion would get louder and find any chance he could to insult and annoy me. It is better for morale that he and I do not test each other's tolerance.
She smiled.
All right, maybe you're right about that. But if you got Ivan to stop, even Oirion would be grateful. He looks ready to cut the man's tongue out.
Shannon looked back at the group and could see that only Cindy was even listening to Ivan. The rest were either trying to ignore him or glaring at him. He looked at Ivan, who was going on about how bad the fat woman smelled.
Rather like a walrus too long in the sun.
Ivan,
Shannon said. He said it twice before the man looked over.
What?
does it not occur to you that the priests do not like your stories?
Ivan looked at him with utter lack of comprehension. Shannon put a finger to his lips.
No more stories for tonight,
he said in Oirion.
Just be quiet.
Ivan opened his mouth to speak, but closed it after a moment. Shannon nodded to him in politeness and turned back to the dark. There was a long, heavy silence after that.
It's late. We should get some sleep,
Revan said.
Shannon, I will take first watch if you want.
They turned south, away from the city that Dave had been aiming for. Those who knew how close they were felt depressed about having been turned away, the city being within mere miles, but the closer dangers of ghouls and the ravine blocked their way. They might have been able to circle around the ravine, but there would remain ghouls to be dealt with. They didn't want to go south because of their pursuers, but in the end, it was decided that south offered the better long-term options for putting distance between them and those who hunted them. Even if they had made it to the city, that was no guarantee that they would not be hunted down. They camped in the trees and ate dried meat seasoned with some herbs that Shannon had found that day. Shannon stayed out of camp and didn't bring anything back when he returned. After 4 days of a lack of food gathering, Theo made use of the stream they camped on. He went upstream a ways, looking for whatever he could find to work the magic. He was, by no means, as skilled at it, as Shannon, and his net took far longer, but when he was done, it had what it needed. The fish were small, but he grabbed out over a dozen. He released the energy and thanked the water and the fish, then realized that he had no way to carry a dozen fish. He dug in his pockets and found nothing. He looked up, thinking how best to carry them in his shirt and not smell like fish, when Shannon appeared and knelt beside him. He showed Theo how to stab the fish through the gills and hang them on a stick.
How did I do?
Theo asked, having a very good idea that Shannon had been waiting for him to get hungry enough to do this and had been watching. Shannon looked up at him as he offered the fish.
To hide what you are doing from the law and prying eyes, by using the trick of reaching under the banks, not fully wise in a warped area, but sometimes necessary in order to avoid unwelcome questions. Use the same finger ropes to catch what you need.
He rose.
Oirion will ask questions. Have your answers ready.
Theo took the fish back from Shannon.
Shouldn't they be able to detect sorcery?
He asked.
Older priests, yes, but older priests use it.
He turned and walked up the stream, leaving Theo to take the fish to camp.
How did you manage that?
Ivan asked in shock and disbelief. Theo handed the fish to Tavia, who knelt by the fire, crumbling the very last herbs into the hot water. She looked up and took the fish with a very pretty smile. Theo took a moment to enjoy the gratitude and then looked up to Ivan.
You know, I thought Azirans were clans of rugged, resourceful men,
Theo said.
What a sad thing to think that even I have more outdoor skills than an Aziran. Are you not truly the Aziran I thought? Or have you been in the south too long and your brain has melted?
Ivan half rose, but Dave grabbed hold of the man's arm and jerked him back down.
Nice, Theo.
Kelly admired the return.
I caught them under the bank.
Theo added, as he sat next to the big woman he hoped would help him if Ivan attacked. Ivan jerked free of Dave's grip and stood there, almost vibrating, his face stern and his eyes hard.
Never talk to me about Izir,
he said, low and deep, almost in a different voice. He turned and strode away.
Ivan's been exiled,
Kelly said softly to Theo.
Can we exile him?
Theo muttered. Kelly smiled a tiny bit. She turned those soft, dark eyes on him.
Some men hide pain with arrogance, others with short tempers, and some with bravado and dangerous lifestyles.
She looked at the camp, then to Shannon, as he returned with a few bits of plant sprigs, and then back to Theo.
What an odd company we form.
She watched Tavia put the fish to the coal and sighed sadly, shaking her head. Oirion was in the lead when they came upon green pastures spread out around a village. It was circled by a low wall built of field stones, mud, and woven willow. It was a far stronger and totally different form of construction than the barrens.
I don't like it,
Revan said from the trees.
But I want to go in.
Cindy objected.
The same man who created those ghouls might own the village. It might be wise to find out if it's safe to go in first.
Oh,
she said softly.
David, wait a bit, and then follow,
Shannon said. He then walked out along the tree line, circling the pasture, and down to the road they could just see. He went in through the gate and slipped out of sight. Once inside, he pulled a wisp of power around himself, hiding himself, and then moved toward the local inn. It was just up the street and clearly marked. It had a stable attached and many travelers inside. That was good, as Shannon would be less noticed. It was a long 2-story building. The small sign displayed a wineskin with the seam torn and wine pouring out of it. It was poor, but it had good business. Shannon circled around to the back and went in through the garden door. The place was lit with oil lamps and smelled of greasy mutton and sweaty bodies. The locals were either burly and scarred or looked to be half-starved. This was not a good place to bring women. That much was clear. He moved around to the darkest corner and looked over the crowd. There had to be a good subject here. The trip was exhausting him, and he was not about to let the opportunity pass. Being a vampire was an art form in many ways, with magics and powers that none other had. They were often easily defended against if one realized how to do so, but the powers were seductive and worked very quickly. He saw the man that he was sure would be the best. He was a big man, the cleanest in the room, and the only one with a woman. She was hardly that, more of a girl who had yet to fully develop. She sat on his lap, scared and mute, while he played dice. She wore a collar of copper and magic. It was unmistakably a slave collar designed to control her. She had power. Shannon could see that as clearly as he could see that she wore a mask, but she was not of interest to him. It was the man. He had powerful energies. He was a wizard, a dark one, not a blood, but not a nice man either. More importantly, he also had an overstimulated masculine core. Shannon knew that particular man would do far more for him than any of the villagers, more than all of the villagers combined. He spun the lure and waited, making it slowly stronger and stronger, but held in check until the man, of his own will, looked over. All he had to do was meet Shannon's eyes. To hold the lure in was a trick that few could master. Most would cast it before they even had consciously decided who their target was to be. Those who could hold it often had to use a draw to make the victim look over, and that was usually what alerted the other to the trap. Shannon felt the man rebel inside, but not resist. It was the sight of a man who was so good-looking that he would inspire another to look at him. That was the emotion that the man thought he felt, not knowing that he was lured by a vampire. At the same time, Shannon felt that this man was more than any common dark wizard. He had energies that could only be given by a priest, a shield network usually put on exorcists. But there was more. He had a wisp of a magic on him that Shannon knew at once: Jerome. This would be interesting. Shannon tightened his lure and waited calmly. This might be a bad idea, but then it might be perfect. Dave entered through the front door. He immediately assessed the crowd, assumed the posture of a pirate, and strode in. Without looking at anyone, he went to the counter and sat heavily on the stool. The owner asked him if he wanted the night's meal. Dave nodded with a grunt. The dark wizard looked at Shannon, despite himself. The lure had taken hold. There was no need for Shannon to remain in the inn. He rose, went out the back door, across the yard of herbs and vegetables, and waited in the dark. It was only a matter of time. He was surprised at how long it did take, but the man came out. The wizard shoved the girl down against the wall as he scanned the yard. Shannon let him see where he was. The man grabbed the girl's hair and snarled something at her, then moved through the herbs to where Shannon waited. He moved swiftly, rushing his last steps, and attacked Shannon. It was a common reaction by men who were overcompensating. It was a good way to start. The energy that was exerted and given off was very potent. Shannon let him attack. It would betray the dark wizard into the full lure, without need for Shannon to even say a word. The attack was very good. It had been a long time since Shannon had been attacked with such skill in both magic and arms. He allowed the man to get a hold of him and twist him around, pinning him against the wall. The wizard had a stun magic and strength that would normally take out just about anyone, and Shannon even felt mildly stunned by it. But Shannon had no energetic grounding to the earth, and so the magic slipped off him with no more effect than that. The attacker was taller than Shannon had thought, and they were actually evenly matched in that area. He had Shannon's arm pinned up while he leaned into Shannon's side. His foul breath was hot against Shannon's cheek. The wizard was sweet with emotion. He was excited by the seeming victory over someone he had thought another wizard. Shannon twisted the lure ever so slightly, and lust started to spin up into the man. It provoked anger and confusion, not guilt as most men would have, but resentment and borderline hate. Shannon breathed in the energy. It was turning the other man's breath into what would become an elixir of life for a vampire as powerful as Shannon. The man didn't give in, but twisted and jabbed Shannon in the ribs with his elbow. He hit with surprising strength and a blast of power that would have killed another man. Shannon felt two of his ribs snap, and he gasped at the sharp, unexpected pain. As soon as the man realized that his attack was not fatal, he grabbed and twisted with power, pinning Shannon to the wall with his arm rather painfully twisted back behind him.
"And who is whose victim tonight?"
The man breathed in Shannon's ear.
"You think I do not know what you are now? Do not be smug, vampire. I have no intention to break your lure. I will use it to break you instead."
He ran his fingers down Shannon's cheek, shifting to pin him to the stone wall with more magic and more weight. His breath was rapidly getting ragged. For as strong of emotion as the wizard felt, Shannon received almost equal to that in life energy, like cool, sweet oil on dry, cracked skin. It didn't matter to him who was pinned to the wall, as long as the energy came. He even let the wizard kiss at his face as the man's fingers searched for the release of the surcoat that made Shannon all but untouchable. Shannon felt the man realize that his victim was wearing black leather. Any wizard here in this place who worked for Jerome would know that Shannon, and only Shannon, would dress so. In that one moment, as the man faltered, Shannon moved and twisted around. Now the man was in his grip. The dark wizard was startled, half in disbelief, and building with fear. This was getting only better. Shannon pulled the man by the collar of his tunic until they were chest to chest.
"I have no doubt who is whose."
Shannon smiled and made as if to kiss the man, but turned away, denying him. The dark wizard snarled at him. Shannon laughed.
"Do you want me to take you then?"
He asked the question that all vampires had to ask. The wizard snarled at him and tried to break the lure, failing miserably. Shannon let go of the man's wrist and ran a finger down his jawline so softly it was felt more as power than actual touch. It made his victim shiver and moan. A vampire could make his touch very pleasant if he so desired, and that was Shannon's tool.
"Just a word,"
Shannon whispered to him. Jerome's wizard licked his lips.
"Don't torment me, just do it,"
he panted.
"I would have torn into you by now."
Shannon smiled at him. He had the permission that was demanded in order to leave the wizard's soul in whatever condition he wanted. He reached in and began to pull out the very life energy. Keyed in through the lure, Shannon drew life straight from the man's cores. He was breathing in the relief through his teeth, leaving his victim out of breath. Every moment, every breath of this was one more hour he could endure Oirion and Revolves' company. Jerome's servant found new strength and tried to grab at Shannon's surcoat front. Shannon caught his hands and blocked them, deflecting them aside easily. Anger rose in the dark wizard, and that started to play into the mix as well. Each shift of emotion would give Shannon a balance of energy that could never be gained through bloodletting. There was a skill to this, and not just any vampire could even use these delicate energies. Most were left frustrated, lusting over their victims when they tried. It took training, power, and a lot of discipline. Shannon had the man trembling and weeping in relatively short time for the strength of wizard that he was. It had all gone rather well, and Shannon felt a great deal more like himself. He was about to release the man when, all of a sudden, Shannon's spell snapped, and physical pain exploded in the wizard. Shannon could not let the death be felt by anyone, or allow that amount of power to slip through his fingers. He drew in all the energy released by the man's death with a great gasp of relief and pleasure, absorbing as much power as he could without repercussions. The man slid to the ground, his eyes wide and face tear-streaked. Beside him, gripping a blood-soaked dagger, stood the girl. She stood with strength and a sense of justice, looking at Shannon. Somehow, she had slipped up beside him unnoticed. That alone was proof that he had been far too low on energy. She turned to run. He jumped over the dead man and caught her. No witnesses. She spun and went into a fight mode, displaying a skill that was far beyond her years. He pinned her hard just as she tried to stab him. A blast of power burned on his shields. She wasn't even human under that mask. She snarled a deep growl that was more like a threatened dog than anything else.
"Let me go,"
she said through her teeth. Then all of a sudden, she froze, shrank, and became silent, as a cloaked man came out of the inn and into the backyard. Fear rose off her like a sweet, addictive perfume. It made Shannon feel like his head was finally starting to clear. He gripped her to him, drawing his cloak around her, his shields hiding them both. This man walked out to the dead wizard's corpse. He felt the wizard's neck for a pulse, and then rose. His scan was powerful and dark. Shannon's shields were almost detected, but the man was looking for something in particular, giving Shannon warning and a chance to tighten his shields, hiding them better. The girl began to shiver with pain as the choker on her neck was activated. Shannon covered her mouth. He could have held her and let her suffer as he drank her in, but risk of discovery was too great. He grabbed her throat and, with a trick of power, unlocked the choker. It clicked free, and the pain ended. The cloaked man, a far more powerful dark wizard than the one that he had just dealt with, stood not 10 feet away, looking directly to where they stood. Even after long scrutiny, he still didn't see them wrapped in Shannon's shields and cloak. Turning, he strode back inside. The girl twisted free and sprinted. He let her go. It was time for him to go as well. He circled around to the front and waited across the street for Dave. The supplies that Dave got from the inn were few, but decent. The villagers were looking for strangers and for travelers. Being one was not a good idea, but the items that he got were not unlikely items for a man with an old injury who was headed to a bath. He left the inn and went up the street to the bathhouse. Stepping inside, he immediately grabbed the choker at his neck and was about to activate it when Shannon entered the door. He could feel the power here and the hostility that was planned for him. Shannon threw his cloak around Dave's shoulders, drew him close, and they escaped right back out the door. Stepping clear of the doorway, they saw 4 rather large men and 2 wizards moving from the inn toward the bathhouse. Shannon didn't wait to watch and took Dave at a fast pace out of the street and away from the village to where the others waited. Whatever magic Shannon used, they seemed to have escaped unseen.
"Not good?"
Dave asked.
"They are looking for us. It is a large trap and not worth it."
"Where will we go then?"
south and west.
There's nothing out there but warped wilderness.
Exactly.
We can't keep them all alive out there.
They have a better chance out there than here.
Cindy began to cry when they told her that they were not going into the village. She went silent quickly, though, as mounted men rode by on the road, passing not 5 feet from where they hid in the brush and trees. The reek of blood magic was so thick on one of them that even she felt it. She gave no more argument, and they left at once, backtracking the way they had come, once again heading south. For several days they traveled south, then west around the mountains. It was slow going and grated on Oirion's nerves. He wanted to move into a run and get some distance covered, but here they were, walking along at Cindy's speed. As it was, they were low on supplies, and they all needed to bathe and rest. Near sunset, they stopped to camp under a prickly pine tree. The chilly night rapidly fell. Oirion moved to where Dave was picking up what wood he could find to burn. He had meant to talk to the young man ever since they had been on the run. Now was the time. He drew a breath and joined him, picking up a few pieces of old wood. Oirion snatched his hand back from a warped spider that tried to strike him. He figured Jamie would have stopped to catch, sketch, and study the damn thing, but Oirion simply stabbed it with a stick. The last thing he needed was someone getting bitten by a warped bug.
You want to tell me how you know Whitefire?
Oirion asked Dave after several minutes, stopping the young man from heading to camp. Dave looked at him seriously.
If I did, don't you think I would have?
I've turned a blind eye to a lot of what you do. You're a sailor's son and have had to learn things on the water that other men might not need, but I think you owe me just a little.
I don't owe you anything,
Dave said, his sailor side showing a bit of his confidence and strength.
Maybe owe is not the best word,
Oirion apologized.
I'd like to think that I have earned a little truth out of someone. The only person who is honest here is Ivan, and that is very disheartening to me.
He half groaned. He was talking like Jamie. Dave looked at Oirion a long time before he spoke.
My uncle was a priest. He was my tutor as a child.
Was?
I don't want to talk about it. I know what I know, and I'll use it when I have to.
He stepped around Oirion and headed back to camp. Oirion followed, a little slower. The matter bothered him all night until he finally had to ask.
I know you don't want to talk about it, Dave,
Oirion said, cutting off one of Ivan's stories that was about a little troll man from the jungle and the prostitutes of Jakarta.
But I really don't understand how your uncle could be of the level to teach such power and then just walk away.
Dave looked up. All he had were his father's words. He was a little curious how Shannon would respond to them.
I don't know. All that my father told me was that he was a priest and had been wronged by the church. That's about all he said.
I suppose he knew you then,
Oirion said to Shannon.
Might I ask what you did to make him leave the cloth?
Oirion knew he was making a fool of himself saying such an asinine thing to Shannon, but he couldn't help himself. Shannon looked over at the man, but he didn't say anything. Part of him was tempted to tell Oirion he was the uncle Dave referred to, but that would only cause more problems. The less Oirion knew about him, the better. Ivan picked up a story about a young man who thought he'd be a good priest until he tasted his first woman. Tonight, no one even argued about Ivan talking. It was better than another fight between Oirion and Shannon. They cut south for several days before they reached an old road that went back up into the mountains. They stopped for the night beside it, built a little fire, and set to cooking. It was early still, but those in the lead all knew that the woods ahead were warped in a rather sinister way and that they had a long day ahead. Tonight, Ivan was, however, in a cheerful mood and took to teasing Cindy, who squealed and giggled at every chance.
What's ahead of us?
Theo asked, attempting to ignore his wife's outrageous flirtations with Ivan.
A long hike,
Shannon said.
It's easy, though,
Raven said.
We'll be on an old road most of the way. The thing to remember is not to stop. Once we go until we leave the mountains.
Why?
Ivan asked.
Big rodents,
Shannon said.
I don't think they will attack us as long as we don't stop,
Raven explained.
They don't seem to attack anything that is moving. They focus and wait for you to stop. It's a lazy way to hunt, but is usually successful.
That's it?
Kelly asked, surprised.
That's all I see,
Raven said.
Can we get through in one day?
Tavia asked.
It's hard to know.
Raven said.
The way that the energy runs through here makes scans harder to do.
Then how do you know what we will face?
Ivan asked.
Because I do,
he said, not really ready to admit that he was using a form of dwarven magic.
We should be able to make it in a day,
Shannon said.
But it will be a long day, so I suggest you all sleep.
Shannon took the lead in the morning. They cut through a misty valley and crossed a beaver dam. The water was steaming in the morning sun. It was chilly. Autumn mist lifted around them, swirling around their legs. But the new fur cloaks kept them warm, and the morning was pleasant for it. They turned west and began to cross a valley that led up into another range of mountains. It was a pretty day, and Cindy sang love ballads to herself all morning. When they reached the line of mountains, the difference was felt almost at once. These mountains were moist, with dense vegetation and a thick growth of branches and vines overhead. It was dark and chilly in the forest, as unlike the dry mountains that they had just left as anything they could imagine. There was the smell of rotting vegetation and perhaps other things. They all noticed the insects as well. Large biting flies pestered them all, buzzing around their heads and biting whenever they were allowed to land. Ivan was harassed the worst, but Cindy was the loudest in her dislike of the bugs. At the forest edge, Shannon fell to the middle, letting Ivan take the lead for once. The path was clear, and it gave the man a harder time to keep up his stories. He walked on, talking, his voice carrying forward. No one in the back able to hear him. After a while, he gave up talking altogether. Ivan stopped only a few hundred yards into the forest and began to retie the string that held his dagger tight to his leg. In that brief moment, one of the giant rodents that Shannon had spoken of leapt from the trees at Ivan. Shannon threw out his hand, palm toward the creature. It hit the ground with a massive thud, rolling to Ivan's feet as a testament to how close to death he had just come. Its chest and head were crushed as if it had slammed into a wall. Its massive rat-like body was greasy and foul-smelling, nose and muzzle leaking blood.
I told you not to stop,
Shannon said firmly. Ivan started to defend himself.
Walk, Ivan.
Raven pushed the man forward so no one would have to stop. They had to step over the 200-pound creature. Travis had to go around it and did so with caution, his eyes on the forest all around him. They all walked and didn't even think about stopping after that. Not even Cindy was about to suggest it, and her songs were missed the rest of the day. Oirion wanted to debate the magic that was used, but there was no time. He wanted to test it, to taste it for the proof he needed, but they moved past too quickly. As the day went on, the party spread out slightly, as a group of hikers always does. Tavia was leading the ponies. They kept in sight of each other, easily following the road. It was overgrown here and there, but hiking was easy, allowing Travis to walk instead of being carried. He seemed to enjoy it a great deal. He had the endless energy of all children and ran back and forth at times, holding each of the company's hand. He'd walk a bit calmly and then run about, swinging at the plants with a stick he had picked up, careful not to ever stand still. It was mid-afternoon when Travis tripped over a branch that had fallen across the pathway. Tavia could see the creature in the bushes, not more than a few feet away, and started to cry out. But like in a bad dream, she couldn't seem to move, let alone react in time to reach him. Travis was just getting up, wiping gravel off of his hand when Shannon stepped into a short dash, passing Tavia and Oirion both. He caught the boy up and cast a glance at the rat thing in the bush. Just as its body tensed to jump, it shuddered and then collapsed motionless. Travis was whimpering slightly, as he did when he was hurt. He showed Shannon his hand. He had skinned it deep enough to make it bleed.
He wants you to kiss it,
Oirion explained from behind Shannon.
I know what he wants,
Shannon said back sharply. He brushed off the boy's hand, closed the little fist, and then turned the boy, setting him up on his shoulders, without kissing his hands. Travis looked back from his seat, high on Shannon's shoulders, and smiled back at his mother. Tavia was slightly taken back. She never would have thought that Shannon would be so fast to move for her child. She had thought that Shannon felt Travis was a burden on the group, so his quick motion was even more impressive. Travis had no idea how close to death he had just come, and she doubted that Oirion realized it either. Shannon was just not the sort of person she'd have thought to pick up a child, let alone to carry him, yet there was Travis riding on Shannon's shoulders. The sun had set when the group finally left the forest behind. They were all tired when they reached an old abandoned village. The village sat on the edge of a marsh, half of it sunken into the soft earth. The remaining structures were built of oiled timbers and clay tiles, speaking back to a time that the area wasn't as poor. They found an old building, larger than the others. It was standing enough to serve as a shelter for the night. They didn't even talk as they stripped the ponies, found dry corners, and collapsed. Rain threatened in the distance. The humidity here was stifling, and there was a reek in the air that might have been the rotting corpses of the villagers. But they didn't care. The non-stop hike had exhausted them, and sleep was all that they wanted at the moment. Dave wondered why Shannon wasn't helping them more, but again, he was sure the man had a reason. He had a reason for everything he did or didn't do. Tavia woke in the night as Travis crawled away from her. Sleepily, she looked after her boy. It was raining outside and very dark, but Oirion had made a small fire just inside the door, for the comfort of all and to try to burn out some of the humidity in the air. The fire was dying out now, but it gave the boy enough light to see by as he crawled toward the dark side of the room. By the flickering light that cast sharp, bouncing shadows, she saw her child crawl over to where Shannon sat, far from the fire, leaning back against the wall. As always, at night, it was impossible to tell if he was awake or sleeping. Shannon looked up as the boy reached him. Travis knelt before Shannon, took Shannon's face in his little hands, and looked deep into his eyes. Shannon let him. Normally he wouldn't have, but tonight, with thoughts of the past haunting him, the immediate presence of the boy was a good distraction.
I hear you,
Travis said with a whisper of telepathy.
How do you do that? Teach me.
Shannon looked at the boy and let the little child's attempt to reach out be heard. It was not likely that the boy would ever meet anyone else able to help him. The fact that, even at so young an age, he was even able to form the words he had never heard was impressive and worthy of Shannon's help.
It is a thing that will take time and practice. Do you feel where I'm touching you?
Yes, head.
That is where you need to think from when you try to speak to others. All people can hear at some level. If you learn to master it, then you can get anyone to understand, with enough focus.
I sleep with you, safe in your shields, me sick this place.
Yes, child, tonight you may.
The boy's sentence structure was short and simple, but it was enough to make sense, and Shannon was impressed. Travis somehow knew that Shannon wore shielding, and that he was safe in it. The warp was making him ill, while the others didn't even feel it. Travis had a power that was waking in him already. To be so young, and even with human blood, it spoke of great powers to come. Shannon drew his cloak around the boy, sheltering him in his arms, as he had often sheltered Dave, and at one time, Oirion as well. Travis was uncanny in his skills at knowing who to trust, who to play with, and what to do to make others feel better. Shannon had to wonder if the boy had come over for his own comfort or to offer it. It didn't really matter. Maybe they needed each other equally. Shannon refused to let Tavia know that he knew she was watching. After a moment, she sank back down to the ground and fell asleep. Shannon looked to where Oirion was asleep, exhausted and struggling to deal with far more than anyone had any idea. Oirion was dealing with more than he himself even knew. Shannon rested his cheek on Travis's head, trying not to think about Oirion as the tiny child he had been. Shannon looked from Oirion to Travis's mother, who had fallen back to sleep. She was a mysterious woman, one who knew to trust her child. He wondered what sort of man had been hers, and who Travis's father was. Was he alive? Was he missing his woman and son? Did he even know there was one? Somehow, he suspected that the man had never even met the child. It seemed that the line to Travis was dead. It was rather sad that a boy like Travis would have no father. Shannon closed his eyes and drew his cloak around Travis more protectively. He let the moment and the feel of the small boy, with his soft curls against Shannon's cheek, drown out the nightmare of the past and the fate of his own sons. Oirion was deep in sleep, dreaming. One moment he was fighting beside Shannon, the next he was struggling in erotic panic. In the dream he was driven by fear that Jamie would find out about Shannon. He had never felt what infidelity could taste like, but he had no other word for the twisted guilt he felt. He wasn't even sure why. He jerked awake and lay sweating and short of breath, his body aching. He lay there long enough to be sure that he had awakened no one, then rolled up carefully and left the building to try to get some fresh air. The air outside was hot, wet, and stuck to the skin. He walked away from the building a bit, just in case he broke down. He held his elbows and tried to pray for Jamie, but couldn't make the words form. He turned as Cindy touched his elbow. He could see her with the power of his priesthood and figured that she had enough Purton blood in her to see, well enough to get around. She looked at him a moment and then stepped up on her toes and kissed him. There was nothing said, and with the dreams he had endured, he simply couldn't seem to make himself object. He kept trying to push her away and scold her. He could almost hear himself say any of 100 things, but there he was, kissing her. She knew all too well how to get through belts and clothes to find what she wanted. He hadn't had a woman's hand in his pants since he was 17. He turned and pinned her to the wall. Frustration, loneliness, and the rage of emotions about Shannon and Jamie roared up and found an outlet. As fast as the emotions roared up and consumed him, he was able to jerk away. He stood, sweating all over again, half afraid to see just who he was kissing. It was like the dream, except with the wrong person. He stepped back, shaky and upset. He wiped his mouth as he turned away from her. He needed to escape, and there was nowhere to go. He caught his breath and stood outside the hall for a moment before he went in, driven by the fear that she was right behind him. He put another few bits of wood on the fire and found his bedding. He lay down, trying to breathe slow and steady, not thinking of Cindy, Jamie, or Shannon. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe to our channel. It helps more than you know. More chapters are available. Join our Patreon at patreon.com/2ravens801.